Hi, Alister Chapman here, and I'm at Visual Impact in Teddington, and this morning we just hold a really interesting workshop, great crowd, on HDR. And in that workshop we looked at two things which is what is HDR, and also what can we now do with this new firmware that Sony have introduced for several of their cameras that allow us to shoot with a gamma curve called hybrid log gamma. Now, if you haven't seen the other video that I've just done, which gives an overview of HDR, I'd suggest you watch that first. Now, in this video, we're going to really home in on what hybrid log gamma is, which is in this new firmware update. Now, as the name suggests, hybrid log gamma, abbreviated very often to HLG, is a hybrid gamma curve. And it's a hybrid between Rec. 709, that gamma that we use day in, day out already for standard dynamic range, and log. Now, one thing to be very clear about with hybrid log gamma is this isn't a log gamma like S-log2 or S-log3 for grading and post-production. Hybrid log gamma is designed and developed very specifically as a delivery standard to be able to send an HDR signal directly from the camera to a monitor. That's what it's meant to be used for, that's what it does, that's what it's very good at. It doesn't, unfortunately, grade very well. Below a recording level of the equivalent of 70%, it's pretty much the same as 709. So for your skin tones, faces, things like that, you have really good contrast, normal looking contrast. So when you view hybrid log gamma on a conventional 709 standard dynamic range TV, you get a normal looking picture. So right now this monitor here, this is Sony's X300 monitor, is set to Rec. 709. Currently the camera here, the FS5, is outputting Rec. 709, and we have a nice contrasty looking picture. Now if I change the picture profile on the camera here and I go to picture profile number 10, where we have hybrid log gamma, and there we are, that's now hybrid log gamma on 709. It doesn't look significantly different. It does look a little bit dark perhaps, and that's because instead of recording white at 90% as you would do with 709, we now record white at 75%. So you record white a little bit lower. The reason that that's done is because hybrid log gamma allows us to capture a very, very large dynamic range. It's around about 11 stops with this camera. That extra dynamic range beyond what Rec. 709 normally does is recorded above 75%. It's a very big dynamic range that's recorded up there, and it's really squashed together a great deal to make it fit within our standard recording codecs. And this is actually why it doesn't grade terribly well, because you're squeezing a very big dynamic range into a very small space. But what this means is that this gamma curve works for both 709, because the lower end of the curve is very much like 709, but it also has the benefit of containing a greater dynamic range. So if your television set supports hybrid log gamma, you can see that extra range. The TV set takes that extra highlight range and stretches it back out again. So if I now take this monitor, so this is hybrid log gamma coming out of the camera being fed into 709, and we have a perfectly acceptable, perfectly viewable image. If I now switch this monitor, because this is an HDR monitor, to the HDR mode, you can straight away see how much more vibrant and vivid the picture is. So the beauty of hybrid log gamma is that it means that the audience at home with standard dynamic range TV sees an acceptable, perfectly viewable picture, but somebody with an HDR TV sees this much more vibrant, much more vivid picture with much greater and much improved highlights. The area where you really see the difference is in something like this. This little robot here is made out of some sort of chrome or very shiny plastic. In standard dynamic range, if we go back to standard dynamic range, in standard dynamic range, not only is it just a little bit darker, but it's not nearly as shiny. It looks like a grey type of plastic, because in standard dynamic range we can't show these highlights very well. They can't be much brighter than white, very limited. But in HDR, just go to the correct HDR curve, in HDR these shiny bits are much, much brighter because the monitor can show those highlights. It looks more contrasty, it looks more vibrant, it's a much better image just generally. So HDR really does give you a significantly improved image, and a hybrid log gamma allows you to deliver one single signal that works both for standard dynamic range and high dynamic range TVs. The other thing you need to consider is the color setting. So if I go into the picture profile, you'll see that as well as the different hybrid log gamma curves, we can choose between 2020 color and 709. Now if I feed 709 to this monitor, as I switch from 2020, you should be able to see the saturation increasing. The colors become more vivid. You can see it here, this blue becomes more vivid, this here becomes more vivid, maybe the reds here become more vivid. If I feed 709 to this monitor, which is currently set for 2020, the colors are actually too intense. They become too saturated. The red here is really very, very vivid. So the correct mode really for HDR monitors is 2020. But if I come out of the picture profile for a second and I put the monitor back to 709, so this is 709, if I feed 2020 to a 709 monitor, the colors are washed out. This red doesn't really look red. It actually looks slightly orange now. But when we switch to 709, it comes back to being red again. So we get the correct colors and the correct color saturation. 2020 looks orange, doesn't look right. 709, it looks correct, it's nicely saturated. For the best match to a 709 TV, that's a conventional TV, we want to have Rec 709 color. But most HDR TVs support Rec 2020 color. So that is something you're going to have to look at and decide for yourself, is who is your main audience. If your main audience is going to be watching on standard dynamic range TVs, then you'll probably want to select Rec 709 color. If your primary audience, your biggest audience, is going to be watching on HDR TVs, then you need to choose 2020 color, because if you have the wrong color mode selected, the colors don't quite look right. So hybrid log gamma gives us a way to shoot high dynamic range, capturing 11 stops that, if your monitor has hybrid log gamma in it, can show 11 stops. But at the same time, when we go back to standard dynamic range, we get a perfectly acceptable picture. Yes, it's a little bit darker, but only by a small amount. The audience at home watching on standard dynamic range TVs is probably not going to realize that this is any different from regular TV. So it's backwards compatible with standard dynamic range, but also works with high dynamic range. So as well as choosing the right gamma curve with your hybrid log gamma, you also need to choose the right color. So that's a very brief overview of 2020 hybrid log gamma and those things in the FS5. If you want to know more about this, I'm quite sure that we'll be holding more workshops and events on this in the near future at Visual Impact, where you can actually find out some of the finer details, like how exactly do you expose this correctly, how do we get the most of it. So thank you for watching. I hope this has been useful. I'm Alister Chapman, and if you have more questions, give Visual Impact a ring. Maybe they'll be able to help you out.